Well, welcome to the 700 Club. More horrible news out of Israel. Hezbollah is now warning Israelis to prepare to wail and weep. The terror group is unleashing massive rocket attacks on northern Israel, and it's threatening a dramatic increase in the days ahead.
Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is blaming Hamas for shutting down the ceasefire proposal. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has more.
As Israelis mark the biblical holiday of Shavuot, Iranian-backed Hezbollah launched more than 200 rockets at northern Israel, the most ever in a single day. Earlier, the Israeli Air Force struck a major Hezbollah command center in southern Lebanon, killing one of its most senior leaders who had carried out attacks against Israeli civilians for years. In response, a Hezbollah official pledged a dramatic increase in the strength, intensity, and number of attacks, threatening if the Israelis are crying about what happens to them in the north, they should prepare to wail and weep soon. Northern Israel has endured near daily attacks since Hamas launched the deadly October 7th attack on Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with the heads of Israel's military, security, and emergency services late Wednesday over the situation in northern Israel. The ramp-up in the north comes as a push for a ceasefire in Gaza has stalled out after Hamas added new demands that Israel can't accept. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is blaming the terror group for sinking the deal.
A deal that the entire world is behind, a deal Israel's accepted, and Hamas could have answered with a single word: yes. Instead, Hamas waited nearly 2 weeks and then proposed more changes, a number of which go beyond positions that it previously taken and accepted.
Hamas apparently now wants the war to end permanently in the first phase of the ceasefire before releasing the hostages. It also doesn't guarantee it will release all the hostages. Blinken continues to push for an agreement and a day-after plan to govern Gaza that does not include Hamas.
Ultimately, it may not be the path that Hamas wants to pursue, but Hamas cannot and will not be allowed to decide the future for this region and its people.
Meanwhile, the recently rescued hostages are revealing more about their ordeal. The three men say they were held in a dark room for 6 months, beaten by their guards, and covered with blankets in very hot weather. Still, Andrei Kozov's father says his son seems optimistic about the future.
He said there were some things that he would never tell us about what happened to him, but he talks about the things he talks about with a lot of humor.
As temperatures soar in Israel and Gaza, there are still 120 hostages in Hamas captivity, about 80 believed to be alive. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
To anyone who thinks that you can have peace with Hamas, please take what they're doing to heart and realize they have no intention of ever having peace with Israel. It's in their very charter. They demand the destruction of Israel. They have called for the killing of every single Jew in Israel, and they're not going to back off of those claims. They vowed to repeat October 7 again and again and again. It's time for us to stand with Israel and say, we back you fully on this. We do not believe their propaganda. We do not in any way give them aid and comfort that somehow or other this is working on the international stage. It's time for the civilized world to say to radical Islam, no, you don't get to do this anymore. My anticipation, I hate to call it a prediction, but it's sort of been there for months now, that at some point in time, Israel is going to have to go into southern Lebanon. That was a no-fire zone set up by the UN. The UN was supposed to police that. From the, quote, no-fire zone, close quote, all of those missiles are being launched into Israel. I don't think they have any choice but to go in there and say, you can't be firing on our civilians from territory that's supposed to be no weapons, no fire. Let's stand with them through this. It's now turned into a very long war, and unfortunately, it's going to be even longer. But if we stand with them, if we show radical Islamists that, no, you can't do this, not on our watch, we vowed never again, and we really mean it, can we defeat that ideology, stop these senseless attacks, and say, no, let's try to have a peace solution, but in that peace solution, if you're radical, you don't get a seat at the table. In other news, New York's mayor is condemning abhorrent acts of anti-Semitism in New York City. Ephraim Graham has that story and more from the CBN Newsroom. Ephraim?
Gordon, anti-Semitic incidents in New York are up 84% so far this year. This week, a disturbing scene recorded on the subway.
Raise your hands if you're a Zionist! Raise your hands if you're a Zionist! This is your chance to get out! This is your chance to get out! Okay, no Zionists, we're good.
Officials are seeking to identify people on the train. Today, police are investigating vandalism against the homes of several Jewish board members of the Brooklyn Museum. Images show one home spattered with red paint on doors and windows. Red inverted triangles were also painted on the home. That's a symbol used by Hamas. This comes just days after pro-Hamas protesters targeting a New York memorial exhibit for victims of the Nova Music Festival. New York Mayor Eric Adams condemned the activity.
Protesters waved Hezbollah and Hamas flags. At other protests, they carried banners reading, "Long live October 7th." And one person even yelled, he wishes, a quote, Hitler was still here. He would have wiped all of you out. These are reprehensible and vile comments. I and every New Yorker who stands for peace stand united against them.
The NYPD's Hate Crimes Task Force is investigating these incidents. At the G7 summit in Italy today, President Biden is signing a bilateral security agreement with Ukraine's President Zelensky. The 10-year deal pledges U.S. support for Ukraine's military, but it does not commit American troops to its defense. The U.S. is also widening economic sanctions against Russia. Moscow is flexing its muscles in America's backyard. Russian warships arrived in Havana, Cuba yesterday. They included a nuclear-powered submarine and a warship that can launch hypersonic missiles. Russia says there are no nuclear weapons on the ships. They're expected to hold military drills over the summer and make a visit to Venezuela. Their presence on this side of the world is seen as Russian President Vladimir Putin's response to U.S. support for Ukraine. Recently, President Biden gave Ukraine the go-ahead to use U.S. weapons for limited strikes inside Russian territory. About 90 miles north, Florida is under a state of emergency as heavy rains bring flash floods. Forecasters are calling the floods life-threatening after tropical storms dropped more than a foot of rain in some places. Hallandale Beach had more than 17 inches, much of it falling in a matter of hours. Floodwaters forced people from their homes and closed parts of Interstate 95. The rain is expected to continue through Saturday. Turning now to America's largest Protestant denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention tackled a host of controversial topics at its annual gathering in Indianapolis this week. Issues related to women took center stage, from female pastors to the use of in vitro fertilization. Charlene Aaron is on the story.
On the final day of their annual meeting, Southern Baptists rejected an amendment to formally ban churches with women pastors. They also voted to oppose in vitro fertilization.
As many as are opposed, would you indicate by lifting your ballots?
In one of the most anticipated votes, the delegates called messengers voted down a measure enshrining a ban on churches with women pastors in the convention's constitution.
It failed to reach the two-thirds threshold that's required to make it an amendment.
Earlier, they expelled a Virginia church that believes women can serve as a senior pastor.
Women have had a prominent role within the ministry and pastoral positions within the leadership of First Alexandria for over 44 years.
The SBC deemed the church's stance in conflict with the Baptist faith and message. Ed Stetzer, dean of Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, says the narrow defeat sends a message.
By the amendment failing, it means there's not a new rule in place that, for example, you can't use the word pastor at any term like children's pastor that a woman might be in. So that tells you that the vast majority of Southern Baptists want to hold the line at a complementarian view.
Lawrence Smith is a messenger and communications director for the Kentucky Baptist Convention.
It just shows you that Southern Baptists are determined to abide by what the scripture says about the office of pastor.
The SBC also grappled with the ethics of in vitro fertilization, moving to express concern about the procedure, particularly surplus embryos. A resolution called on Baptists to reaffirm the unconditional value and right to life of every human being, including those in the embryonic stage, and to only utilize reproductive technologies consistent with that affirmation, especially in the number of embryos generated in the IVF process. The denomination also voted to continue the work of abuse reform. A task force formed 2 years ago to create resources and build a database of pastors accused of abuse is expiring. With the database still not created, the messengers voted to hand over the issue to the executive committee.
For the sake of just the rightness, the goodness of followers of Jesus doing what they should do, there needs to be paths to take it seriously. And what I would say is it's not going to be easy, and it may be one of the more controversial things that they lead, but that's what leaders do.
Meanwhile, from a field of 6 candidates, the SBC elected North Carolina's Clint Presley as its new president. Presley is known for his conservative leadership style.
It took 2 ballots, or 3 actually, to elect someone, but I think Clint's going to do a great job, a great man of God, and he'll do a lot to. If there are any lingering fractures among the messengers, among our convention, he'll work to heal those.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.